step below deck. The air here is not merely still, it is heavy, a thick, living thing pressing in from every side. It clings to the throat, a blend of stale sweat, the cloying sweetness of rot from the bilge, and the metallic tang of damp timber. Above, the rhythmic groan and protest of the hull are a constant lullaby of confinement, a sound that promises no escape. This ship, a world unto itself, is more accurately a wooden coffin, perpetually rocking on an indifferent ocean. In this cramped, perpetually damp existence, the greatest enemy was not the cannon shot that tore through oak, nor the cutlass that opened flesh. It was an unseen adversary, a silent invader that poisoned the very air they breathed and tainted the water they drank. Disease. More deadly, more relentless than any man-o'-war or storm. Here, ventilation was a luxury unknown. The shared hammocks, slung low and close, absorbed the sweat and sickness of 100 bodies, never truly drying. Fresh water, if not entirely absent, was always guarded, often brackish, and never enough. Every surface, from the rough-hewn planks to the coils of rope, carried the grime of days, weeks, months, and in the dark corners, behind stacked barrels and beneath rattling floorboards, lived an unseen army. Rats, scurrying and breeding, their presence a constant chilling reminder of the filth that was simply a fact of life. Cockroaches crawled in the shadows, their chitinous bodies brushing against sleeping faces. The flickering, smoky light of a single lantern did little to dispel the gloom, instead casting grotesque shadows that danced across exhausted, hollowed faces. Men coughed, a dry, hacking sound that echoed in the close quarters, or cleared their throats with a wet rasp. A persistent ache in the joints, a sudden nausea, an unusual fatigue that went beyond mere labor. These were the first whispers of the invisible enemy. Dismissed as sea weariness or a touch of the ague, they were the body's first ignored protests, the insidious beginnings of a slow, agonizing betrayal. For in this age, few understood the microscopic horrors that swarmed around them. They knew only the chilling effect, the fever, the flux, the rot, and the final, inevitable cold. The body's first ignored protests often began with a subtle yet persistent weariness, not the exhaustion that followed a brutal shift on the rigging, but a deep, pervasive lassitude that seemed to seep into the very bones. A pirate, reliant on every ounce of strength, might first dismiss it as nothing more than the constant drain of life at sea. But soon, the bruises would appear. Not from a fall or a fight, but from the slightest bump against a bulkhead or the friction of a rope. Purple-black blotches would bloom beneath the skin, tender to the touch and slow to fade. The skin itself, once taut and weathered, might begin to feel strangely dry, almost leathery in places, yet prone to tiny fissures. Then came the insidious assault on the mouth. A persistent metallic tang, the unmistakable taste of blood, would become a constant companion. At first, only a slight bleeding from the gums when biting into hardtack, easily ignored. But the gums would not heal. Instead, they would swell, growing spongy and discolored, an angry purplish-red mass that bled with the slightest provocation. The pirate's breath would turn foul, a sickly sweet odor of decay, as if the rot within was already beginning to claim him. Eating became a torture, each mouthful a painful reminder of the encroaching sickness, as teeth, once firm, would begin to loosen, shifting perceptibly in their diseased sockets. Some might fall out entirely, leaving agonizing, raw holes. Old wounds, long healed and forgotten beneath layers of scar tissue, would begin to weep. A gash from a cutlass, a scar from a splinter, all would reopen, refusing to close, stubbornly bleeding and festering in the damp, salt-laced air. The body, deprived of something vital, was unraveling from within. Movement became an ordeal. What began as a dull ache in the knees or elbows would sharpen into a grinding, burning pain in the joints. Every step on the pitching deck, every haul of a rope, every turn in a cramped hammock became a test of endurance against this searing agony. Limbs felt impossibly heavy, a dead weight that dragged one down. The once strong hands, so skilled with a cutlass or a knot, trembled with profound weakness. And then the mind itself would begin to fail. A persistent fog would descend, dulling the sharp edges of thought, making even simple commands seem distant, muffled. Short-temperedness would give way to a brooding, listless apathy, a profound despair. To watch a shipmate, once robust, descend into this slow, agonizing decay, to witness their teeth fall out, their skin erupt in putrid sores, their body waste away to a gaunt shadow, was to see one's own grim future reflected back. It was a shared horror, a communal sentence, endured within the confines of a wooden world that offered no escape. The pirate knew with chilling certainty that this was not merely a sickness, but a slow, living rot, consuming them from the inside out. Yet scurvy, though common, was often a drawn-out misery. Far more violent and swift were the invisible contagions that could sweep through a ship like wildfire, twisting the gut and burning the flesh. One day, a man might stand at the rigging, full of complaints, but otherwise sound. The next, he would be hunched over, clutching his belly, a sudden, searing pain igniting deep within his bowels. This was the Flux, Dysentery, a swift and brutal descent into agony. Agonizing, burning cramps would seize him, doubling him over, forcing him to the slop bucket again and again. The incessant purging was not mere waste. It was a desperate, violent evacuation of blood and mucus, a tearing away of the body's very lining. Each spasm left him weaker, thirstier, his throat raw and dry, an unquenchable craving for water that could not be satisfied. But even if the ship held fresh water, it was often the very source of the contagion,
unseen microbes breeding in stagnant casks, turning life-giving liquid into a carrier of death.
Rapid dehydration would set in, sucking the moisture from his skin, hollowing his eyes, turning his mind to a hazy, desperate fog. His strength would ebb away with every agonizing expulsion, leaving him a hollowed-out wreck, slick with his own bodily fluids. Then there were the fevers, sudden, consuming blazes that scorched the body. Typhus, carried by the lice that crawled unseen in every seam and thread, could turn a robust man into a shivering wreck within hours. Violent shivers would rack his frame, an uncontrollable tremor that rattled teeth and bones, even as his skin burned with an internal inferno. His brow would be scorching to the touch, his eyes glazed and bloodshot, fixed on nothing. Delirium would follow, a jumbled chaos of thoughts and visions, distant voices echoing in a mind adrift. A telltale rash, a constellation of angry red spots, might bloom across his chest and belly, a silent declaration of the disease's hold. Eventually, many would fall into a stupor, a merciful unconsciousness that preceded the final quiet breath. Below decks, the scene was one of overwhelming despair. The air, already thick with the stench of unwashed bodies and bilge, now festered with the putrid, metallic smell of vomit and excrement, a sickening sweetness that clung to every surface. The constant sound was a symphony of suffering, weak, rasping cries for water, the rhythmic retching of men emptying their guts, the heavy, ragged breaths of those succumbing to fever. Fear of contagion gnawed at the healthy, a silent terror that watched every cough, every pallor. Efforts to isolate the sick were often futile, a desperate dance in cramped, shared quarters where privacy was a myth and fresh air a luxury. One man's sickness quickly became another's. Helplessness hung heavy in the air, a thick, suffocating blanket, as men watched their shipmates, their friends, their only companions beyond the horizon, claimed quickly by an enemy they could not see, let alone fight. Life, so precious and hard-won on the open sea, could be extinguished in days, sometimes hours, by a simple sip of contaminated water or the bite of a tiny louse. The men were dying, bodies betraying them with fevers and flux, and so the last hope often rested with the ship's surgeon. This was no trained physician, no scholar of anatomy. More often, he was a barber, a cook, or perhaps a sailor who'd seen enough broken bones and gaping wounds to develop a grim, practical competence. His tools were few and brutal. A handful of unsterile blades, some crude saws, a variety of foul-smelling tinctures, and perhaps a cauterizing iron. In the dim, flickering light below decks, amidst the groans of the sick and the pervasive stench of illness, he was less a healer and more a grim reaper's reluctant apprentice. When a fever raged too high, or a gangrenous limb began its slow, putrid decay, the treatments were as terrifying as the diseases themselves. Bloodletting was common, an ancient practice believed to balance the humors. A vein would be opened, blood allowed to flow, staining the rough deck planks a dark, metallic red. The patient, already weakened by sickness, would only grow paler, weaker, often collapsing into a deeper stupor. Yet the surgeon saw it as a necessary evil, a purging. But the most dreaded remedy, the one that stole voices and haunted the living, was amputation. Picture it, a man, leg crushed or arm rotting, lashed down to a grimy table, or perhaps just a sturdy sea chest. His eyes, desperate and pleading, fixed on the surgeon, whose own hands might tremble slightly. A swig of cheap, burning brandy, if any could be spared, offered the only solace, numbing the mind for only a moment. Then the dull thud as the saw found bone, the grotesque grind and rasp of steel against sinew and marrow. A scream, raw and primal, quickly stifled by a rough cloth shoved into the mouth, mingling with the sharp, metallic tang of blood that coated everything. The process was agonizing, drawn out, each stroke a fresh wave of unimaginable pain. Once the limb was severed, the desperate work began to staunch the flow. Red-hot irons, hissing and spitting against raw flesh, would sear the arteries closed, the acrid smell of burning flesh rising to mix with the bilge and sweat. Then, rough, unsterile linen, perhaps torn from an old sail, was wrapped tightly around the stump. The chances of survival were slim. The omnipresent risk of infection, often introduced by the very process of healing, far more deadly than the initial injury or disease. The surgeon himself, a man weary from witnessing such suffering, knew his own limitations, his own compromises with death. He performed his grim duty, often with a heavy heart, knowing that even his cures were often a prelude to the final cold embrace of the ocean. The constant threat of disease, the agony of its progression, and the brutality of its cure took a toll far deeper than mere flesh and bone. It seeped into the very spirit of the crew, a creeping, insidious paranoia that gnawed at the edges of their sanity. Every cough, every ache, every sudden fatigue became a harbinger, a whispered promise of the suffering to come. Healthy men eyed their ailing shipmates with a complex mix of sympathy and stark, self-preserving fear. Were they next? Had the contagion already found its way into their own blood? A silent, invisible passenger waiting to erupt? For those marked by the deep sickness, particularly in its final, consuming stages, despair was a constant, suffocating companion. Isolated, often tucked away in a damp, dimly lit corner of the hold, far from the bustling life of the deck, they languished. The familiar voices of their comrades grew distant, replaced by the relentless creak of the hull and the rhythmic slosh of the bilge below. Hope, a precious commodity at sea, dwindled to nothing, replaced by a weary resignation. They watched their own bodies betray them, piece by agonizing piece, their minds slowly drifting in and out of the fog of fever or the dull ache of rot. The chilling absence of a familiar voice The slow fade of human connection was perhaps as cruel as any physical torment. Then the inevitable moment. A final rasping breath, perhaps unnoticed amidst the groans of others, or marked by a sudden, chilling silence. Death at sea was a common, unceremonious affair. There was no time for prolonged mourning, no land for burial. The body, once a vibrant vessel, quickly became a burden, a source of potential contagion, an obstacle in the confined space. The grim routine began immediately. The deceased, often still warm, was stripped of their meager possessions, then carefully prepared. Rough canvas, perhaps a discarded sail, was tightly wrapped around the body, sewn shut with coarse needle and twine. The sharp crack of canvas being drawn taut, the rhythmic pull of the thread became the only funeral dirge. At the feet, a cannonball, a heavy stone, or even a shot of ballast was carefully secured, ensuring the body would sink swiftly, cleanly, into the depths. There was a quiet efficiency to it, born of grim necessity. On deck, under the indifferent gaze of the sun or the cold glow of the moon, a small, silent gathering would form. A few murmured prayers, perhaps offered by the captain or a literate shipmate, would break the silence. Words of solace, of eternal rest, cast out into the vast emptiness. The air would be thick with the taste of salt spray, perhaps mixed with unshed tears, a stark reminder of their own precarious existence. Then, with a practiced lift, the body was heaved over the rail. The final muffled splash as it slipped into the dark, indifferent ocean, a sound swallowed instantly by the ceaseless creak of the ship, the sigh of the wind in the rigging, and the endless rush of waves. There was no lingering, no prolonged goodbyes. The men would turn immediately back to their duties, the rhythm of the ship demanding their attention. The dead were gone, left behind in the endless deep, their stories dissolving into the vast, churning waters. Another name crossed off the muster roll, another space in the cramped hammocks, another ghost to join the thousands lost to the ocean's indifferent embrace. For those who survived, the shadow of disease remained, a phantom ache in healed joints, a persistent cough in the cold, damp air, a deeper line etched into a sun-weathered face. This constant, invisible enemy fundamentally defined maritime existence, forcing every man who stepped aboard a pirate vessel to be hardened, yes, but also perpetually adaptable, and above all, exquisitely vulnerable. Disease was not merely an unfortunate occurrence. It was an omnipresent factor, a brutal force shaping every decision, every route plotted across a chart, every daily routine. It dictated how long a ship could remain at sea without making port for fresh provisions. It influenced whether a raid was attempted, knowing that a weakened crew might not survive the ensuing battle, let alone the return voyage. It was why a good surgeon, however rudimentary his skills, was prized almost as much as a skilled quartermaster or a steady hand at the helm. This deep sickness, the silent killer, was the untold cost of life at sea, far outweighing the dangers of cannon fire or cutlass wounds. Historical records,
sparse as they sometimes are, hint at mortality rates from disease that dwarfed those from combat. A pirate's glory, if he found it, was often hard-won not against rival ships, but against the insidious rot within his own body. The burning fever that claimed his shipmates one by one. So, when we envision the golden age of piracy, let us look beyond the romanticized image of swashbuckling adventure and stolen treasure.
Let us instead remember the stifling air below decks, thick with the stench of sickness and fear. Remember the unquenchable thirst, the agonizing cramps, the desperate, pleading eyes of a man succumbing to scurvy or fever. Remember the quiet splash of another body committed to the deep. This was the true horizon for many, not distant lands or rich prizes, but the daily, grinding battle for survival against an enemy that lived within and without their own bodies. Their resilience, born of constant suffering and the grim acceptance of fate, is a testament to the human spirit's enduring, if often brutal, capacity to adapt. It is a legacy that deserves our quiet consideration, a stark reminder of the realities that shaped lives far beyond the shore. If this deeper dive into the unvarnished history of the high seas resonates with you, I invite you to consider subscribing to Immersive History. Your support helps us continue uncovering these forgotten tales, allowing us to bring more of the past's authentic sensory experiences to life. And if you have a thought or a question about the brutal lives of these seafarers, please share it in the comments below. We read every one.